Thanks for joining me here at Cold Case Christianity. I'm Jay Warner Wallace. Okay, we've been kind of working through some principles that I talk about consistently when I'm arguing that we should be more forensic in our beliefs. I've written a book called Forensic Faith, and the whole reason why I wrote that book was to help believers like you and I develop a faith that is more than just a blind faith. What we want is a faith, right, that is grounded in good thinking skills, in good reasons, in good evidence. And we're not called to have a blind faith, as we've talked about in prior episodes, as Christians. Because Jesus didn't ask anyone to believe blindly. He continually demonstrated his power, his deity to people, and then pointed back to the evidence of the miracles to help them believe that what he was saying was actually true. The disciples did the same thing, right? They consistently pointed and relied upon their eyewitness testimony when making the case to others. That's called direct evidence. So what we want to be able to do is to hold a faith that is grounded in good evidence. And so we're going to start talking about just what that looks like. In fact, this episode is going to be really about how to read and think more clearly and more broadly. It's all about taking two initial steps as detectives about reading and thinking. And I'll try to make that clear as we get further along in this episode, exactly what I mean when I say we should be reading and thinking more clearly. Now, I can recall, and if you're somebody who's followed my work, you know that I've been on Dateline a number of times. I think I've actually been on Dateline more than any other detective in the country, working cold case homicide investigations. We actually have a link. If you go to our website at coldcasechristianity.com, you can take a look and just type in the search bar Dateline, and you'll see the article that shows you, that links to you all the episodes of Dateline, so you can watch them yourself. But my point here is that I can recall a time, one episode we were filming, and it was a difficult case. It was a case involving a man who had killed his wife and had gotten rid of her body and then had claimed she ran off. She disappeared. She vanished on her own free will. And so he filed a report just to make it a little clearer for his alibi and for his own thinking on this and what he wanted to convince the police department about it. He filed a report of a missing persons, and our agency accepted that report. And for the first 6 years, that case was investigated as a missing persons case. Shouldn't have been. Should have probably been investigated that night as a potential homicide. But for whatever reason, the initial officers did not investigate it that way. And it stayed and got misshuffled, and by the time we opened it up again, 6 years had gone by, and there wasn't a single piece of physical evidence to make the case. Not a single piece. It was a problem. Right? I mean, this was a missing persons report. But then when we contacted her six years later, her family said she never showed up again. We knew we had a problem. So now we conducted an investigation. We ended up arresting her husband. And sure enough, we're in the process of going to trial. And NBC, Dateline, is interested in the case. And they decide to make an episode of Dateline. And as I'm sitting there doing the interviews with Keith Morrison, who is just fabulous and just a really sweet man, I couldn't say enough good things about him. And he would always have a little bit of a tug-of-war intellectually with his people he interviews. And he does that even with the officers in these cases you'll see on Dateline. And sure enough, on this particular night, this was not a great case. This is a case where there's a lot of open questions. There wasn't any physical evidence. I couldn't tell you how he killed her. He never confessed to it at this point in the trial. He was just denying that he was involved. I couldn't tell you how he killed her, where he killed her, when he killed her, what he did with her body, how he moved her car. A lot of unanswered questions. Then the jury had to face those unanswered questions. And they actually convicted him in spite of those unanswered questions. And as I'm sitting describing the process to Keith in the interview, I'm surrounded by sound technicians and the videographers and the producers sitting in the room. And I had a sense as I'm talking about this that no one in the room actually believed that defendant had done that crime. Even Keith pushed back on it. So I think you got the wrong guy. I don't even know how they could convict this poor guy, given what little evidence you had. So I said, well, wait, no, I made a case for why I thought he should be convicted. I made the case all over again in front of Keith and the producer and the videographers. And honestly, I don't think anyone was convinced. The more I described it, the less they seemed to be convinced. I realized before long that I was the only person in the room who believed we had convicted the right guy. So I said, okay. Lucky for us, after that interview was taped, we had a sentencing hearing where we actually, after the conviction, they have another hearing in which family members of the victims can speak, family members of the defendant can speak, because now the judge is about to sentence the convicted defendant to his jail sentence. And it was at that point that our defendant in this case confessed to the entire crime. We didn't even have a location of the body prior to his confession. And he told us what he did to her and where he put her body. All that being said, it was clear now to everyone and the whole Dateline crew that we had the right guy. But it was interesting to me that in this process, at least up to that point, I was the only person that felt that confident about it. And the reason why I think I felt confident is because I had trusted a process. I had confidence in my conclusions because I had trusted the process that got me there. And it turns out these are just simple, basic skills you learn as a detective. And you can kind of work down that systematic approach to investigating cases. And whether you like the conclusion or not, and I will tell you that the man that we convicted in this case was incredibly likable. I liked him on a personal level, but he did kill his wife 30 years earlier. What are you going to do? But I did like him on a personal level, so did everybody else. But if you just follow the steps, whether you think you're going to like the conclusion or not, you're going to end up more than likely in the right place because you follow the time-tested techniques and approaches that detectives have been using since my dad was a detective and long before him. So I want to teach you in the next few episodes of Cold Case Christianity what those techniques are. Because I do believe you could actually apply those to the Christian worldview. You could apply the same techniques to examining the Gospels, to examining the New Testament, and I think you'll end up in a place systematically after you do all of these things. And honestly, if you're a skeptic, you might not like where this is headed. I wasn't like, vehemently opposed to it, but I wasn't where Lee Strobel, for example, who did not want Christianity to be true. I was neutral. I just thought it was silly. And I thought there was no point in even investigating because it was so obviously untrue. But you may not like where your investigation leads, but if you follow these principles, you will end up probably in the right place. That's what I did, and that's how I ended up as a Christian. So what I want to do over the next 2 or 3 or 4, and by the way, I love teaching these principles, and here's why. I think sometimes when we make a case for what we believe as Christians, if we don't kind of lay down the rules of evidence, if we don't talk about how evidence comes together to form a conclusion, why certain inferences are reasonable given the approach we've taken evidentially, well, then people may not agree with you even though you've given them good facts. I think learning how to investigate, learning the rules of evidence, learning the nature of how cases are made, if you can learn to communicate that to others, then it makes your case that much easier to present. Because so for example, if you don't know the standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt, not beyond a possible doubt, you might find yourself struggling because you don't think you've got enough evidence when you had enough evidence a long time ago. But you didn't understand the standard of proof. So I think what we have to do is take some time to explain what detectives do and how evidence is assembled and what's in and out of bounds, and then evaluate. How do you evaluate? How do you come to the proper inference? When is enough enough? Those are the kinds of questions that I'm more and more happy to talk about, because I think once you have a good foundation, you got a better chance of coming to the right conclusion. I sometimes worry when we talk about the need to be a good Christian casemaker, and we describe this additional attribute of Christian belief or Christian discipleship, that, hey, we need to know enough about what is true and the facts about what are true. We need to have some kind of theological and philosophical underpinning and historical knowledge that'll help us to make the case. And we kind of owe that as ambassadors of Christ. That's our duty, to know enough to be able to communicate. Well, gosh, that sounds like a lot more work than my old approach to Christianity, which was just, hey, it feels good to me, and I've seen God work in my life, and I just have a certain level of certainty that's based on my own personal response to things that have happened. Well, remember that everyone of every religious stripe has similar explanations for why they think Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam or Mormonism or whatever is true. They've had some experience that confirmed for them it was true, or they've were raised that way by their parents. These things do not guarantee you will have truth to begin with. So it's important for us to go the extra mile. But man, that's a lot of work. Well, I think diligence is important. And by the way, I think you're already working hard or have already gained a great deal of knowledge in a number of other areas, whether you've thought about it or not. The question is, are you applying yourself in the right areas? So there's stuff you already know about. You've got some trivia in your head from movies you like to watch, what Netflix series you're binging on, what sports team you're following, all that stuff. You spent time doing this. Now it's time to reappropriate those energies into something important. But you're right, there is going to be more work involved. You're going to have to be diligent if you want to learn the case for Christianity and then master the approach to communicating that case. This is that training process we've been talking about here on the show. It's another level of a commitment. But I will tell you this. There is a relationship between your diligence and your confidence. We talked about it before the break about that episode of Dateline, that investigation. Why was I so confident he was the right guy? Because of everyone in that room, I had more diligently examined the evidence than anyone else. I knew that case better than anyone else. And the more I was diligent in my investigation, the more confident I became in my conclusion. There are folks in the Christian worldview and the Christian family who really are not as confident as you would think they would be, since they hold the truth, but it's because they don't know yet, evidentially. They don't have the kind of certainty because they haven't yet been diligent to turn over every stone, to turn every corner, to make sure they've examined the evidence carefully. There's a relationship between diligence and confidence. The more diligent you are, the more confidence you'll have. Now, let's go one more step. There's also a relationship between confidence and character. The more confident you are that you hold the truth, the less defensive you're going to be. You're not going to do that fight or flight thing. You are going to calmly interact with people because in the end, you have good evidential reason to believe that your view is true. You don't need to raise your voice about it. You don't need to be excited about it. I mean, look, I make a case in front of a jury. I'm pretty neutral. I don't even like sometimes the fact that I have to convict this guy because I kind of like that defendant, right? But truth is, I'm very confident evidentially he's the guy. Now, you can say all kinds of things and lie about my character and all that. Look, in the end, I'm pretty confident this case is good. So I remain calm. There's a relationship between diligence and confidence and character, so it makes sense that if you are more diligent in your study of the evidence, you will have better character in defending the case. So let me give you a first principle, a simple investigative principle that I think will help you learn how to investigate Christianity or any other worldview or any other issue. Our agency has a vault. It's a locked, heavy door room. And you walk inside, it's very narrow, and it's got folders, 3-ring binders on all from floor to ceiling. These are all the violent crime, homicides or officer-involved shootings that have occurred in our agency for as far back as we can assemble paper documents. And they're in colors, 3 colors. Black folders are all the solved homicides. Red folders are all the unsolved homicides. Blue folders are all the officer-involved shootings. Okay, when I first opened up and started to work cold cases, I went into that vault with my sergeant and we looked at all the red notebooks and we pulled them all off the shelves and we started going through them and cataloging them based on what we thought the needs were in each case. If we were going to open this case again, what would our strategy be? What are the areas that still need to be investigated? We made a list of all the red notebooks. And I'll tell you, that took forever, okay? I'll bet you we spent 7 or 8 months just doing that before we started any cases. Because in every one of these notebooks, we had to read it from cover to cover. And the reason why we have to read it from cover to cover is that sometimes, these things are very old and papers have been torn out and misplaced, and so you have to put them all in the right order, and we start reading them, and you might have an early report in which the officers thought, oh, maybe it's this is the solution, and then you find out 3 reports later that they interviewed some people and they discovered, no, that's not going to be the right answer, so they've changed course, and you need to know everything they did. You can't stop halfway through because you might end up at some place where they hadn't yet discovered some important fact. So you keep on reading. This might be a 3 or 4 year investigation. And so you have to read it from cover to cover to see what occurred over 3 or 4 years. You start every investigation by reading your casebook cover to cover. Now, I know that sounds like a stupid, simple principle, but it's a critical principle. And I'll tell you, it's not easy to read those notebooks. I'll tell you why. Sometimes the reports that are in there are highly scientific reports, right? They're lab reports. They're sometimes not even written that well. They're hard to read. Some of them can be sometimes confusing because you're like, gosh, at the first couple of reports they raise up issues that I'm not even going to resolve until report 9 or 10. So as I'm reading along, I'm going, what in the world is even going on here? So it can be kind of confusing. Some of those reports are just flat boring. Okay, they just are. Like, I got to read every line here. Well, yeah, because look, it didn't get solved the first time. So you better read every line. Maybe you'll pick up that one little thing that somebody skipped over because it's a boring report, and that'll end up solving the case. So you got to read every line. Oh my gosh. It will drive you crazy, okay? A lot of these will just wear you out. But you got to read it cover to cover. And sometimes I will take the time to reorder the reports. Because sometimes when you open the book, the reports are in order by category. Oh, all the CSI reports here. All the medical reports there. And I often want to put them in chronological order so I can see exactly what happened day to day, because sometimes something that happened on day 3 is the reason why they did something on day 5, which then ultimately caused something on day 10. And if I order the reports not chronologically, but instead by groups, by categories, by type, I might miss it. I think you know where I'm headed with this. That's the nature of reading reports for cold cases. But it's also a requirement that we have as Christians when we open this casebook. A casebook called the Bible. We have to, look, you think you understand really fully? Could you understand full Christian theology, for example, from reading 1 Peter? Well, no, it's a piece. You're going to have to, but to be more robustly, you want to read all the letters. But then if you didn't have any Gospels, just read the letters. No, you need to read the Gospels. And do you see what I'm saying? You have to read all of it to understand the relationships that are drawn, the theological relationships, the intellectual relationships that are drawn, the connectivity of certain ideas. And then you can't just stop with the New Testament. My gosh, you kidding me? The Old Testament is not something you can just kind of stick in your back pocket. I'll read it if I get to it. You need to start, and the whole scope of Scripture tells an amazing narrative that has to be told from cover to cover. You have to read all of it. How many of us as Christians don't read the entire book? We've read some piece of it. We read, oh gosh, we started in Genesis, we got through Exodus, that's pretty cool. Then we get to Leviticus, we're like, oh my God, by numbers, we're out. That happens all the time, right? Well, we have to read it cover to cover. And you might find it easier to read if you took it out of the categories and kind of, there are Bibles that are actually written and assembled on the basis of the order in which the events took place. I've also read it that way. That's very interesting. It opens up new insights. Try it. But I also want to show you why it's so important just to think about things in the context. Look, this idea of redemption, of the fall and the redemption of mankind is most fully and most robustly understood when you understand the narrative from the Old Testament. It starts right there in Genesis all the way through to Revelation. Everything's context. Context, context, context. I have a good friend, Greg Kokel at Stand to Reason. Look him up at str.org. Great organization, does wonderful work, great resources. Greg always talks about, he actually wrote a little booklet years ago called Never Read a Bible Verse. And of course, he's not suggesting you shouldn't read your Bible. He's suggesting and really asking and imploring you not to just read one verse out of context. He's saying, hey, you got to read everything in its context. This is true in casework. You have to read everything in the context of where the case was, why he did that in 1981, because what happened in 1980 that caused that, and then what happened in 83 that, you see what I'm saying? It's context, context, context. And you can't just remove remove one word from an interview and make a case about it in front of a jury. What if he said something before or after that that clarified what he was saying? Everything has to be studied in its context. Let me show you a verse. You'll see it here on your screen of Psalm 56 out of context. Be merciful to me, O God, for men hotly pursue me. You can see here on the left how this young lady might try to use that verse to discuss her own experiences as an attractive young woman. But that is clearly not what the verse is about. And you see it in its context on the right side in Psalm 56, where it's David talking about this. All day long they press their attack. My slanderers pursue me all day long. Many are attacking me in their pride. When I am afraid, I will trust in you. Now, I just tried to do this in a humorous way to show the difference and the importance of context. If you take any verse out of context, you're in danger of reading it the wrong way. That's why it's so important for all of us. If we got to think about these things, think about the evidence we see in Scripture in the context of what we know after having read it cover to cover. So I guess my whole point today is to get you to start thinking about finishing that plan you started 5 years ago when you said, I'm going to read the entire Bible cover to cover, and you didn't do it. Well, now is the time to go back, and you've actually got a good investigative reason to do it. It's the way you investigate cases. It's also the way you can investigate the truth of Christianity. And before we end this episode, this may remind you of why it might be valuable to take that approach from working cold cases and apply it to the Christian worldview. If you think about it, I'll show you another illustration from Forensic Faith, the book that I wrote. Again, that's a book I wrote to help you take an investigative approach to understand your duty, to start training, and to then investigate and communicate the claims that you discover. And I show you in that book this illustration, which shows you kind of the similarities between working cold cases and investigating the Christian worldview. The idea here is that my cases are old cases from the distant past, and I have no living eyewitnesses that I can call in and interview today. A lot of those eyewitnesses are already dead. And I don't usually have forensic evidence like fingerprints or DNA that'll help me. If that was the case back in the day, it would have been solved back then. It's still unsolved because those things did not exist. So here I am looking at a case where all I have are supplemental reports from the distant past describing something to which I have no access sometimes to the authors of those reports or to the people they were talking to in those reports. And I've got no DNA or fingerprints or the kinds of things you might think of would be helpful. Well, that sounds an awful lot if you think about it. Like the examination of the Gospels, reports from the distant past for which I have no access to the eyewitnesses, no access to even who wrote those reports, and I don't have fingerprints or DNA that I can employ to come to a decision. Do you see how the approaches we're going to start talking about, the evidential strategies that we're going to start talking about, actually could be pressed into service in examining the Gospels the same way we press them into service to examine cold cases? There are some distinct similarities, some things you can learn about examining reports with no access to the people in the past that can be applied to the Gospels themselves. So I hope as we start talking about this stuff, it'll be helpful for you to develop the ability to defend what you believe, to become a Christian case maker. So until next week, I'll see you right back here at Cold Case Christianity.